תודה לאפרים על הניתוח המאוד מעניין והמאוד מעמיק. היה משפט אחד שהייתי רוצה אולי שהדוברים האחרים יתייחסו אליו, והוא הערכה שיש סיכוי קטן מאוד שמישהו באיראן יתעורר בוקר אחד וילחץ על המתג הגרעיני. אני שותף להערכה הזו, אבל אני חושב שהחשש האמיתי הוא לאו דווקא חזון אפוקליפטי שבו אחמדינג'אד או מישהו אחר קם בבוקר ולוחץ על המתג, אלא דווקא האפשרות שאיראן עם יכולת כזו לא תהיה לה שום בעיה לספק יכולות דומות, גם אם לא באותה רמה, פצצות מלוכלכות, נשק ביולוגי וכימי, ואולי אפילו אלמנטים של נשק גרעיני, לארגוני טרור או למשטרים רודניים, דבר שיהפוך את הסביבה שלנו להרבה יותר מסוכנת מאשר היא. אבל אני מעריך שגם בזה אנחנו נדון בהמשך. הדובר הבא הוא מרטין קרמר. מרטין קרמר הוא עמית בוושינגטון אינסטיטוט למדיניות המזרח הקרוב, עמית בכיר במכון אדלסון של מרכז שלם, וכן עמית במכון אולין באוניברסיטת הרווארד. מרטין קרמר הוא מומחה לאסלאם בן זמננו ולפוליטיקה ערבית. הוא כתב וערך מספר ספרים בנושא. מרוצת הקריירה האקדמית שלו הוא גם עמד בראש מרכז דיין למחקרי המזרח התיכון באפריקה באוניברסיטת תל אביב. מרטין, בבקשה.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Ambassador Gillerman. Thank you, Oded and Itamar, for the invitation. I was going to speak in Persian, but English is about 20% more economical. So Ephraim has addressed what he rightly calls the essence of the threat. In my remarks, I want to deal with a subordinate facet of the Iranian threat. It's Iran's purported ability to set the Middle East ablaze in the event of a confrontation with the United States. Now, it's often said that Iran has more strategic depth than one might imagine from an inventory of its own military capabilities, both real and photoshopped. This depth, it is argued, derives from the support of Arabs and Muslims worldwide for Iran's anti-American posture. In the current issue of Foreign Affairs magazine, for example, we read the following: the Arab people do not share the anti-Iranian sentiment of their governments. Tehran enjoys significant soft power in the Middle East today, end quote. So anyone who would dare threaten or pressure or strike Iran must take into account the reactions this might unleash beyond Iran. Now, just to give you a taste of this argument, I've harvested these quotes from a paper by a think tanker in Washington on what might happen across the region if Iran were attacked. And I quote: the Iranians would feel unrestrained about resorting to terrorism, their best bet against America's military might. Consider a scenario where Al-Qaeda and an unleashed Hezbollah overcome Sunni Shiite divisions to form a tactical alliance against a common enemy, the United States. We could ignite destabilizing violence in Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, and Indonesia. Our European allies host large immigrant Muslim populations, and a U.S. attack on Iran could unleash a wave of terrorist reprisals throughout Europe. There is also the risk of radicalizing America's Muslim population. End of quote, but I assure you that in the source, the original source, there's more. In this scenario, the verbs are dramatic. As you heard, unleashed is used twice. And a move against Iran is depicted as the trigger for an apocalypse of violence. Now, everyone here will find some part of this scenario more believable than others, but to the extent that it resonates as a whole, it's thanks to two assumptions that have become widespread over the past several years. The first assumption is that U.S. policy has so angered Arabs and Muslims that they're bound to rally behind Iran in any U.S.-Iran confrontation. Red-hot hatred of America trumps everything, erasing the differences between Persian and Arab, and Sunni and Shiite. Iran, as the last anti-American force left standing, would benefit from that floating rage that once fixed itself to Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein. Now, this assumption, ladies and gentlemen, owes a lot to the annual Zogby polls taken in 6 Arab countries and presented to Americans as the final word on the attitudes in the Arab street. Now, these polls are most famous, of course, for showing a dramatic erosion of America's standing in Arab opinion due, so the polls suggest, to Bush administration support for Israel. But lately, the Zogby poll has also tried to measure Arab opinion toward Iran, and the findings, if believed, would suggest that Iran is translating Arab resentment against the U.S. into support for its nuclear agenda. In one particularly pertinent question, Arab respondents were asked what the outcome for the Middle East would be if Iran acquired nuclear weapons. In the March poll, 44% said a nuclear-armed Iran would be positive, 29% said it would be negative, and 12% said it wouldn't matter. Now, if these polls are accurate, they would lend support to the notion that Arab opinion has aligned with Iran's nuclear ambitions, which it believes are directed against Israel and the U.S. But are these polls accurate? For example, the largest percentages in specific countries who think the outcome of a nuclear-armed Iran would be positive, according to the polls, are the Saudis at 73% and the Emiratis at 51%. That 3/4 of Saudis and half of all Emiratis would prefer to live next door to a nuclear-armed Iran beggars belief. And indeed, another poll of Arab opinion taken just a month ago for the Doha debates came up with significantly different results. In that poll, Arab respondents were asked whether the Middle East could tolerate a nuclear Iran. The region-wide answer was no by 55 to 45%, and the margin in the GCC states was 58 to 42 against tolerating a nuclear Iran. Now, I don't want to get deeply or at all into the problems of polling methods in these contexts. I do want to suggest that the statement, Tehran enjoys significant soft power in the Middle East today, is potentially misleading. That soft power outside the Shiite circle is itself soft, not something that Iran can rely upon in a crunch. And there looks to be a split in Arab public opinion about Iran's nuclear program. And while the different polls do show across the board a clear Arab preference for a negotiated settlement, there's no evidence as to what people think should be done if negotiations fail. Later in the session, we'll hear about a range of options. We have, in fact, no idea how they might play in the various Arab countries. The second questionable assumption is that in matters of national security, what people think in the street trumps what rulers think in the palaces. The Arab people we read in foreign affairs do not share the anti-Iranian sentiments of their governments. Well, I leave aside just who the Arab people are. It's an awfully broad category. But even if it's allowed that things look differently from outside the palace than from inside it, why assume that the rulers lack the leverage to shift or neutralize public opinion if they try? And in the palaces, of course, there is unease about Iran's nuclear ambitions. It manifests itself in different ways. The Gulf states, of course, are triangulating between Washington and Tehran because they're small, and that's what they always do, and because the U.S. has seemed to them irresolute. But it's striking how much more outspoken the Saudi and the Egyptian media have become, both in criticizing the ambitions of Iran and berating other Arabs who seem indifferent to that ambition. Over the summer, one Saudi columnist wrote, and I quote just as an example, "The absolute priority must be our strategic security in the Gulf, which is threatened by Iran, even if this comes at the expense of the Palestinian cause. We need to push the world powers towards military confrontation to neutralize the Iranian enemy, whatever the cost, before the nuclear bomb makes it too late." End of quote. And Saudi columnists have described the split in the Arab world dividing the Arabs of the north from the Arabs of the south. The former are allegedly blinded by their preoccupation with Palestine, and they are susceptible to the siren calls emanating from Iran. As another Saudi columnist put it, and I quote, "Some of the Arabs of the north are in a strategic alliance with the Persian enemy. It goes without saying that according to all the indicators, the primary and most dangerous enemy of the Gulf states is Iran." End of quote. And I think this presentation of the issue probably reflects views that are held by the royal bankrollers of Saudi newspapers and journalists. In many of these pieces, the United States does stand accused, not of support for Israel, which is nothing new, but of strengthening Iran largely through its folly in Iraq. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means that it's still possible for President Obama, when he delivers that speech in an Islamic capital, to win some Arab endorsement of the principle that all options should be on the table. It may be possible to build some Arab support for what Obama has already stated, that, in his words, and I quote him, "It is unacceptable for Iran to possess a nuclear weapon. It would be a game changer." End quote. The United States, of course, will always be regarded with a mix of fear, suspicion, and resentment in this part of the world. But this doesn't mean it can't form alliances of convenience against those who excite still more fear, suspicion, and resentment than it does. Over the years in the Middle East, the United States thwarted first the Soviet Union and then Al-Qaeda in Iraq through alliances of convenience. And there's a basis for that vis-a-vis Iran as well. Now, of course, we mustn't downplay Iran's genuine cards beyond its borders, its relationship with Syria, Hezbollah, and Hamas. Iran, too, has allies, and allies of convenience. But even in worst-case scenarios involving them, we know what the outer limits will be because we know their capabilities. For some of those capabilities, there are answers. Others should indeed give us pause. But if we're to be intellectually consistent, we have to give equal consideration to the worst-case scenario for the region if Iran does acquire nuclear weapons. And that scenario has been drawn most recently and vividly for us in the new report by the U.S. National Intelligence Council, Global Trends 2025. And I'll read a quote from that report. Reinforced perceptions of Iran's intent and ability to develop nuclear weapons potentially would prompt additional states in the region to pursue their own nuclear weapons programs. It is not certain that the type of stable deterrent relationship that existed for most of the Cold War would emerge naturally in the Middle East with multiple nuclear weapons-capable states. The possession of nuclear weapons may be perceived as making it safe to engage in low-intensity conflicts and terrorism. If the number of nuclear-capable states increases, so will the number of countries potentially willing to provide nuclear assistance to other countries or to terrorists. The potential for theft or diversion of nuclear weapons, materials, and technology, and the potential for unauthorized nuclear use also would rise. End of quote. Well, that's a pretty disturbing worst-case scenario. And in the battle of worst-case scenarios, it's very hard to beat. The National Intelligence Council goes on to describe it as more dangerous than the Cold War, which is saying rather a lot. President-elect Obama was right to call this a game changer for the entire region. I think we would all prefer to play the game we know for lower stakes than the game we don't know for much higher ones. Thank you.